I'm John Purcell, and I'm a specialist with the IEP Technical Assistance Center. We have an office in Indianapolis. We are through the By College of Education, the Bloomberg Center within the By College of Education at Indiana State University, funded by a grant through the Department of Education, special ed dollars. And our mission is really to provide supports for teams, for teachers, because we're all in this together. And we work together, we develop together. So, welcome today. Colleagues, they'll introduce themselves, but when we put this together, I was really looking at a systems, big picture. Administrator, I'd been an elementary administrator for 25 years after I taught, and then in central offices, curriculum, transportation. So I'm looking at this as what's it look like up here, and then they'll get into some classroom, that ounce of prevention into more of the classroom. Okay, before we begin with slides, without your pencils in your hand, I want you to take about 30 seconds and think of this. Then I'll have you pick up your pencils and respond for about 60 seconds. So wherever you'd like to respond, go ahead and respond to that. Kind of monitoring as you're writing. And it's good to see the thought that went into that, because this will frame everything we talk about this morning. Everything. Your response to those two questions. With the person at your table, or if you want to combine tables, just take about a minute, not much time, but just to chat about that. Anything you want to share with your colleague. Like I said, this will frame everything that we do today or this morning. The key point for this morning as you look at those objectives is this, the essential key point. The way our task, I guess, is the way I can put it. Our task is to be intentional and systematic in the way we think about and structure our school environment. Our task is to be intentional and systematic in the way we think about and structure the school environment. When you take what we've responded to up here, which is personal, and we put it within that, we can see that we're structuring that school environment intentionally based on our beliefs, based on our own purpose. I'm an educator because that purpose. So that fundamentally shapes what will happen in that school environment. Not just for you individually, but you collectively as your school. That's what we're really going to look at this morning, is that environment and that culture within a system that helps you frame those very important concepts within a structure that, okay, this makes sense, this makes sense, this makes sense. We'll take a look at that. So the objectives today are up here. If you have the PowerPoint and you'd like, you have highlighters, key terms or key phrases that you see in the objectives. And I'll refer to these objectives several times this morning. Key terms, key phrases. Take about a minute and a half. Okay, share out. Key terms, key phrases, and why. Any table. Then I'll pick on you, so. It behooves you to volunteer.
So the first sentence, go ahead.
You can present this morning. Fundamental factor. Culture, fundamental factor. Yes? And that's a struggle we really want to be intentional about working through at some point. Sooner the better. We'll talk about what that looks like with behavior. so that we have that shared commitment, shared understanding of terminology. What's insubordination? This school, this school. Where do we put that data? So yeah, that's part of the system. Yes?
Just to piggyback that, we also did ongoing share, just because we have to continue that. And we had all the same highlights, but.
Yeah, yes.
To have this all continue and ongoing.
It's not said and done. You know, we've done it. So, okay, good. This one probably didn't make sense to you at this point, so what are you talking about? What questions? All right. Essential key point. Our task is to be intentional and systematic in the way we think about and structure the school environment. So let's look at how we might do that. When you talk about systems, we're talking about, you've seen the triangle, right? This triangle? Okay. And when we look at this triangle, we're talking about students who are at different levels at different times. They're not locked in to these levels, behaviorally, academically, with mental wellness. So when we look at those three domains, we know that those are systems that work independently. Behavior works independently from academically. It has to function independently, but it also has to function interdependently. Like the body system. Circulatory has to do its job. Respiratory system has to do its job. Oh, by the way, they have to work together. So when we look at these three domains, academic, behavioral, and mental wellness, they work together providing this fluid level, these fluid levels of support that in our environment we have to structure to provide in our culture, in our building. So we think of a student, Jerry comes in, music, art, self-regulation, some behavior issues, a lot of behavior issues, literacy. He has a mix of all three of those domains that that we're providing supports for, these fluid levels of supports. Today we're going to talk about behavior. So as we do so, remember we're talking about how to work with behavior specifically, but not independently from academics and mental wellness. To start that, or to do that in a systematic way, to provide that support and provide that foundation, 5 questions. Are you familiar with Rick Dufour's work in PLCs at Work? Out of Adlai Stevenson High School in Chicago, did tremendous work in the 90s in his high school with structuring professional learning communities, and you can find that information online and learn more about that. He has 4 questions. I've added a question to help us look at those 3 domains and those fluid levels and put those together in a logic sequence. First, what must students know and be able to do? Behaviorally, do they know what they're expected to do? How they're expected to conduct themselves? What must they know and be able to do? We were talking about literacy this morning. What must they know and be able to do in literacy? What must they know and be able to do to conduct themselves? What must they know and be able to do as far as self-regulation and coping? So you can see those 3 domains working together with that one question. Again, we're talking about behavior this morning. Okay, so how do we design? Okay, we've decided this is what they must know and be able to do. We're solid. How do we design, keyword, the environment and instruction so that they do conduct themselves as expected, learn to the level that they're expected, cope to the level at which they're expected? So we set that foundation. What must they know and be able to do as far regarding student conduct? How do we design the environment and instruction design environment instruction so they do conduct themselves as expected. How do we know that they're conducting themselves as expected? Academically, that they're learning as expected, behaviorally, as their or mental wellness, they're coping as expected. But for the sake of today, how do we know that they're behaving, their conduct is that which, on that first question, is expected? How do we respond when students are already doing what's expected? We're going to respond in some way to a varying degree of behaviors. So when students are acting or behaving, I shouldn't say behaving themselves, acting as expected, behaving as expected, what do we do then? How do we respond to that? And then how do we respond when students are not conducting themselves in question 1 as expected? So when we go back to the objectives, questions 2 through 5 rest all on, you talked about consistency throughout the district, throughout a building. What must they know and be able to do? You have a solid understanding of that. You have a solid understanding of that. You also have a shared understanding of that. Going back to that essential key point, our task is to be intentional in the way, and systematic in the way that we think about and structure that school environment. This is the way that we can be systematic and intentional in structuring that environment. Reflection on those questions. How would those questions, in your building, in your district, how would those questions help you frame your overall student behavior program? Expectations, I should say.
I think question 2 is kind of where we fall apart. We expect the students will come in and behave the way they should behave.
They just come in.
And we sort of reward them if they do it accidentally, but
Accidentally, I love that.
we don't, if they happen to display the behavior we want, we'll say good job. But I feel like we don't do a lot of that, like how are we going to make sure our environment, that we're teaching them how to be successful and that we have an environment set up to help them be successful.
Yes. And recognizing that is so important. Many of us, and I say us as a school administrator, get stuck in, you're not doing it. Pointing the finger when 3 fingers are pointing back at me. Other reflections on that as far as the systems in your school that exist, because systems exist whether they're intentional or not. You have a system for behavior. Yes?
We just, with our society, how much it's changed, we just expect the kids being the same and knowing the same. We expect them to just know what we knew at that age.
Right.
It's going almost like I learned long ago, it's like, act your age. Well, what does that mean to them? They don't know that, so
Yeah.
it's like, I mean, I can say, we expect them and we reward them for what they accidentally, that's a good way of putting it,
Yeah.
accidentally do. But society has changed so much that I don't think they know what to do. We need to truly teach them as they come in, especially middle school. I'm 5th grade, they're coming, to a new building.
Yes.
To me, I don't know what, you have to kind of just teach them fresh.
So our alignment, you said, from into a new building, that alignment within that system
Yeah.
then becomes critical.
Yes, absolutely. We comment on that, frequently, just to be able to have them transition well or align, that as they move over.
And in an ideal situation, like you talked about when I was a kid, when I look back, Then you had alignment beyond the school. The expectations with parents, parents within a neighborhood. You know, I'm sent home, and when I get home, Mrs. Robinson calls, if she calls, or my mom says, hey, what are you doing home? And I'm truthful, if I'm truthful, then there's that support. Well, you know you're not supposed to act that way. I mean, you know, she is supporting the neighbor. So you had that cohesiveness and that shared understanding beyond the school, which may be more fragmented now that we see. Yes?
Our office is in the middle school hallway. And so I was an elementary teacher for many, many years, primarily kindergarten, first grade. And
Oh,
so
wow.
I spent a ton of time doing PBIS training and Daily 5 training. The whole first part of the school year, just training the kindergartners and first graders, the procedures of how to be in school.
Yeah.
So that they knew how to do it. But we dump them off into middle school, and they don't do any of that anymore.
Yeah.
And it's like chaos and anarchy, just trying to walk through the hallway to refill your water bottle. Because they turn into like these little velociraptors and jump.
So then we come back to we come back to your question, you know, the second question you were talking about. How do we design the environment?
Yeah.
What expectations do we have at that level? How do we design the environment based on the way they're coming in? We know they have skills. They know they have fulfilled the expectations at least to some degree in elementary, and they now have free reign because that's not consistent. Yeah. These are the three domains that we saw here. So those three domains, like you said, they are working together, independent circles working together, wrapped in that school culture. So we're going to talk more about school culture. Just a review, now that you've seen a few slides working through, I guess, the introduction to what we're going to get into as we go through these specific steps. Do these objectives make more sense now? Especially this one? Or I should say, did the objectives make more sense now that you see the questions? Okay, foundationally, what must students know and be able to do? If that is absent, the rest of the questions are irrelevant, no matter what we do. So a student comes in, based on what you said before about students, and I look, and I see, okay, new students coming today. Oh, wow. Top 10 of the class. Attendance is good. Great. Oh, not again. He just left us. That shapes our culture. That tells us a lot about I'm an educator because I'm an educator. Because what you say you believe will either be affirmed or betrayed by your conduct. Well, I believe this. Really, it's not what I saw. So what you say you believe will be either affirmed or betrayed by your conduct. So this student comes in, whoever that student is, whether it's or that student that comes in free and clear. Our culture that we have developed will determine which way that student goes. So that first interaction that we have, student's going to, believe me, the student's going to come in and test this. They're going to have anger, they're going to have anxiety, depression, learning issues, a learning disability. They're going to present with baggage, good and bad baggage, positive and negative. But it's not up to them. It's up to us to design that environment, going back to that Second question, how do we design that environment and instruction so they're successful? Because success predicts success. If we start that student and work with that student to be successful, it predicts more success. Same with failure, based on what we have designed. Now, for the sake of today, based on your beliefs, your values, you have a vision, a mission within your school. So very simply for today, I'm going to suggest that I'm going to throw out that our mission is to provide the best possible education in the safest environment. It's about two things: learning and safety, learning and safety, learning and safety. Best possible learning, highest levels of learning, safest possible environment. And that the success of all students relies on the sense of the success of each student. I don't know how you can explain that you have all if each are not successful. How all students can be successful if each one is not successful. So, for the sake of today, everything that we look at, we're going to look at that, our intention based on our beliefs as we structure that environment. And today we're going to talk about it within the frame of reference that safety, education, safety, all students. Terrence Scott, I talked about PLCs at work and Rick DeFore, his work. Terrence Scott, Dr. Scott, does a lot with behavior. Really good resource for behavior. And I have in the back of your packet, there's a list of resources. So this is something that he has developed. Climate and culture. The difference, the same. Your climate, our climate, is that first time we walk in, we walk up to the building. The landscape, the care of the building from the outside, I'm already framing what I think about this building, the climate. I walk in, the first thing I hear, I'm greeted, the first thing I hear, the first thing I smell, the first thing I see. Is there anarchy in the hallways? Velociraptors? Do I need a whip and a chair to get through the hallway? The climate is that day-to-day feeling that you get as a teacher when you go to work in the morning. Really kind of frames how you feel that day. Do I have to go in again today? This has been a disaster all week. Climate is the character of the school, the quality and character of the school, and is shaped around the beliefs, the interactions that we have, the decisions we make every day. All of those components feed into the climate, that ongoing day-to-day feeling of the school. In time, that climate, over time, becomes your culture. Embedded. Those beliefs are now embedded. The decisions that you have made along the way have now become the norms. The expectations that you've developed from those decisions are now entrenched. You have certain traditions that are sacred, whether it's a field trip or a graduation ceremony. All of those then become your culture. But that least desired behavior, if tolerated over time, can become the norm. What's happening in that climate over time will become the norm. Do we want our culture to develop by accident or by intention? Do we want to design our climate or just let it occur, our culture, or just let it occur? Reflect on that for just a moment. I call it cognitive chewing. Kind of chew on that cognitively. Any notes that you want to jot or anything? Do we design our climate, our culture, or just let it happen by accident? Think of your school. Because where the rubber meets the road is right up here in climate and culture. So on your paper, in your book, with your slides, on your guided notes, either place, if you would number 1 through 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Select 2 or 3 of those that you see in your school, pretty prevalent in your school. 2 to 3 of those. I'm getting out of your way. Go ahead and jot notes. And you're going to take just a minute to share that with your thoughts with those with whom you were seated as well as with the rest of us. Okay, share with those at your table, and so how about tables?
2 and 5 for sure.
2 and 5, okay. Hey, Lake Central is cohesive. You can leave now. You're good.
Unfortunately, sometimes 4. I mean, that's, yeah, unfortunate.
Why 2? Let's go. Why 2, why 5, sometimes 4? Why 2?
We do, I mean, our school in particular, we have a lot of our special ed programs for the district, like some of our more severe, so we have a lot of students who have a lot of needs.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we see a lot of struggle. I do think our staff at our building is like well aware of that, so I think they do a good job of meeting kids where they're at collectively.
Mm-hmm.
But we definitely see the struggle for sure.
You said the same thing?
Yeah, it looked like a little guy who was really frustrated and working really hard, and that's who I support, so those are the classrooms I'm in the majority of the time.
That's where your heart is.
Yeah.
5? How about you? 5?
That to me is a good teacher working with students and small groups, individualized attention.
Okay.
We see that a lot too.
You also have some of the 4.
Well,
But you talk.
Yeah, they're middle school, so
Okay.
yeah, unfortunately,
a lot of the 4.
Yeah.
more than we'd like.
We talked about, remember the 3 domains working together? If we're going to get to learning, we have to emotionally be ready to learn, because emotion drives attention and attention drives learning. If I'm attending to something that happened in the hallway, I'm not learning. Emotion drives attention, attention drives learning. But yeah. Okay, Griffith.
We have the same thing, 2 and 5.
Wow.
I mean, and I think, like Central said, this is the population of students that we are working with,
Mhm.
number 2, so we see that quite a bit. But then of course, we have some really good teachers that are able to address those problems, so I would say 2 and 5 are the most common ones we see. We don't see too much. There is a little bit of 3 and 4, but not very much.
Okay. So we talked about being very intentional and systematic in thinking about and structuring our environment. Now, we recognize that 2 is there. We've talked about in particular, you've mentioned students who have specific learning disabilities, some type of maybe identifiable learning issue. So if we're structuring our environment, it is our responsibility to reduce or eliminate that. Tier 1, general education, special education, that system working together. That's academic. We're in that academic domain. But how's he going to act out behaviorally because of that? So our culture, it is our responsibility to design a culture where students are successful, a climate day to day, and eventually developing into that entrenched culture. Here's the guy I worry about. Now, he may be thinking about what he's going to have for supper. That's the young man that when we develop our culture determines whether he sticks out his hand to shake your hand, or sticks out his hand and points a gun at you. That's the responsibility that we have with our culture. Within the culture, when we go back to behavior, talking about behavior, how many of you have expectations on the wall? Responsible, respectful, and safe. How many of you have those 3? Anybody? That's pretty common.
Yeah, I think it varies in our buildings. Some
Does
have
it?
it more prominent than others.
Okay. You have in Griffith?
Same.
You have them? Okay. Those expectations, those are broad constructs that really should, because they're broad constructs, they should really reflect your shared beliefs and expectations. If we as a school aren't on the same page here, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit in more detail, that is going to develop through the shared beliefs and expectations, and from that you're going to have routines and practices. So here's the expectations. This is what we believe about learning. This is what we, remember, safety and learning. This is what we believe about learning. This is what we believe about safety as a district or as a school. Because of that, we're going to have routines and practices and procedures in place to keep all students safe and learning. But those expectations are broad, such as respect. We're also going to have to, within that, then define behavior that's not acceptable within those expectations. We're going to have to clarify within these expectations staff practices. What is the staff obligated, responsible to do within those expectations? And then commit ourselves to those. So in the next several slides, we will talk about those expectations and beliefs, what those look like in reality. Safe, responsible, respectful. They're broad, they encompass a lot of behaviors, most behaviors. They're applicable to different locations, whether it's a assembly, whether it's arrival at school, dismissal at school, cafeteria, PE, science lab. And we have within those expectations certain language we use in that second question, how do we design instruction, the environment instruction. We have language that we use when we correct students, and notice I put correct and teach, correct, and remind students, because we are teaching that student. In elementary, you do a lot of that on your knees with the kinders. All right, hey, why is that not respectful? Mr. Purcell, all right, so what are we going to do now? So you do a lot of, but it's a teachable moment with those expectations, hopefully. Let's look at some examples that are well-defined and necessary. They are well-defined and they are necessary. You have to be very clear then with these well-defined and necessary expectations, safe, responsible, respectful, in that how you define those, because if they're not clearly defined, you're going to think of it differently, even in the same district as you think of it, and certainly Griffith is going to think of it differently than you do. Now, it doesn't have to be across districts. It's kind of nice if we're all on the same page, but, you know, in reality. But definitely within the building, ideally within the same district. So, for the sake of today, respectful means showing consideration or regard for someone or something. Broad, positive, encompasses a lot under which we can identify specific behaviors. Responsible, doing what you're supposed to do and accepting responsibility for your actions. Being responsible. Safe. Keeping yourself and others from being harmed. Notice keeping yourself. Student in the science lab trying to light the gas. Stop it. They're well defined, and these have to be in place before we can get to behaviors and frame that, because expectations are the framework of behaviors, that day-to-day action. Those expectations are the framework for those day-to-day encounters that is founded on our beliefs. Our culture then is that framework with the behaviors inside founded on our beliefs. So our expectations then, that framework with the rules and behaviors, specific behaviors inside of that, what's our belief about students in the hallway with respect to learning and safety? Learning and safety. What expectations do we have for the students in the hallway in middle school with regard to our dedicated mission, learning at the highest levels, safest possible environment? Your expectations will come from, hopefully, a well-defined mission, what you're all about, your beliefs. So for middle school students, that dependable system of rules and procedures, that will provide the structure when you have a dependable system of rules and procedures. Your expectations will then specify what those are within those expectations. So if they're being responsible, running around in the hallway, what? Safe? You got 2 strikes. You got 2 strikes on my chart, you know? When we go back to those expectations and I define those, are you acting in the way that you're supposed to be acting? No. Are you acting in a way that could reasonably hurt you or someone else? Yeah. So we're tying that all back. Because, excuse me, the brain, our brains always look for patterns. We're always looking for patterns. Associating what we see, what we're experiencing to what we already know. We're always looking for those patterns. And we're also looking at when something occurs, does it make sense? Does it have meaning? That procedure, that expectation, does that make sense? Yeah. Does it have meaning for me? Is it relevant? Yes. That will stick. If it doesn't make sense, it drops. So in academics, when we're teaching and we're chunking that instruction, we want to make sure, is that making sense to them? Can they relate it to something? Do they see the relevance? Does it have meaning? Because if it has sense, makes sense and has meaning, it is more apt to go through the, for lack of a better term, the filter, so that it then is locked into at least short-term memory so it can start making associations. That's the same with our procedures. When I was transportation director, the drivers would, a small town, and they had their buses at home, and they would take their buses, they'd run the route, and then on the way home, sometimes they'd stop at the local restaurant, they'd stop at the IGA store, do some grocery shopping. So you'd see 1 or 2 buses in a parking lot. We had a really good relationship, rapport with them, because I instituted a mandatory safety meeting every month. I said, oh, by the way, you're going to be paid for this. I know, but. Well, long story short, by the time we got into it and they had Operation Railroad Safety, railroads would come and talk to them. State troopers would come and talk to them about state law regarding buses, and they could ask questions, what happens when, what happens when. Some had never pulled a pin on a fire extinguisher. Why do you use a fire extinguisher? Only to provide a way out, to exit the bus. If the engine's on fire, we're going out the back, don't put out the fire, just let it go. Get the kids out. Oh, and by the way, if the engine's on fire, which door do you use to exit? Back door. Who's going to go first? The students up front. We're going to do a reverse evacuation. That's where the fire is. So they would practice with their students. If they have to go out the back, we're going to do a reverse evacuation, and they would do this with their students every month, a different type of evacuation. And they would start from the okay, which side are you going to start on? Driver's side. So they come out, and they exit out the back. So by the time we were like 3 months into this, they were pretty puffed up, like, hey, you know, we know all this stuff. We're doing pretty well. So driving their buses, and I said, hey, folks, you're going to have to take your buses home. You can't stop. Mr. Purcell, John, that doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. Students, that doesn't make sense, Mr. Purcell. I said, okay, let me help you. Let me help you make sense. Maybe this will help. State law says that the buses are to be used to transport students to and from school and special events. Bless you. As well as some other national emergencies, so forth. Only transport students to and from school. You park your bus in the grocery store parking lot. The little 4 or 5-year-old, the mother is putting the groceries in the car on the other side of that bus. He's running around. She's not watching. He runs out from behind the bus. Pickup truck's coming in. What blocked the driver's view of that child? Our bus. First of all, we have to live with the proximate cause, what we did. We did. Secondly, liability. But first of all, what we did. So, okay, it makes sense. I don't like it. You don't have to like it. I know. I get it. I wouldn't like it either. Park your buses, come back in your vehicle, in your car or whatever, and then get your groceries or get together for lunch. The point is, after that, it made sense. So for students, these dependable rules, when we're teaching those rules and routines, it makes sense that we have these procedures in place. And it's dependable because it happens in your room and in your room and in that hallway throughout, because it's not just your kids, it's our kids. It's not all students, it's each and all. So it's important that we teach those dependable system of rules, we reinforce those and consistently practice those, even in middle school. What's the expectation out here? And you don't have to be a drill sergeant to do that. In fact, when it comes to rapport and relationships, we don't want you to be a drill sergeant. Again, when we're looking at those broad expectations under which we're going to have rules, they're going to be well-defined and necessary. And I would urge the schools in your district that have those to, if that's what they're going to use them or take them down. They're cluttering the wall if you have expectations up there that are never referred to. In fact, students almost get, I don't know, it's just not important, so they just get used to, okay, well, why, now you all of a sudden you point to it, it's been there, why are you talking about it now? It's been there all year, what are you talking about? It's new. No, it's the structure. So when you have those, a way to present those is with a matrix. This matrix has our expectations, where those expectations specifically are expected, and particular behaviors within those. Okay, John, great. I see the matrix. How do you decide what rooms? Why does it say in class? Why does it say arrival within class? What were the two things I said, our mission? All students learn at
Safest
high
environment possible.
high levels. Yes. High levels safe. If we are to achieve high levels and safe, we're going to find or use those environments where that will happen, where it's most important. It may happen all over the place, but these are the key locations. If we're talking about learning at high levels and safety, those are the key locations. That's how we choose those. Together, we decide what that's going to look like based on our expectations. If we're going to be safe, you're going to stay in your assigned area if that's what you decide. If we're going to be responsible, you're going to give your teacher the cell phone. That's the expectation. So these are the what, the broad whats, those overarching concepts, constructs. This is the where, this is the how. Now, that poster on the wall makes sense. Oh, because we're always target talking those expectations. What's the expectation here? What's the expectation here that we do this? Should be an automatic question. What's our expectation? What's our expectation? What expectation, and ideally then, as we teach, what expectation do you have of yourself to be safe? What expectation do you have for yourself? I need to be responsible. Because discipline, the Latin root for discipline is discipulus, which means to learn. Like disciples, learning. Discipline is a matter of teaching. In this case, teaching behavior. I mentioned Rick DeFore a few minutes ago, and he, in his PLC at Work, that model, he talks about tight, loose, tight. Tight, in this case, with behavior, thinking about tight is, what are those core expectations? Safe, responsible, respectful. Those are core. Those are non-negotiable across the classrooms. The other non-negotiable is safe, high levels of learning. There's some wiggle room in how you get there. As long as it's based on these and it leads to this, there's some wiggle room. The reason I say that is that may look different in physical education than it does in algebra. So there is some, to answer your question, there's some wiggle room in that as long as we're anchored on both ends. Make sense? Remember, we talked about those expectations being dependable. Those are dependable. We're always going to teach from those. We're going to teach those behaviors when we talk about how do we design the environment and the instruction. We're going to anchor it on this. Okay. We know what our expectations are. Let's talk about specific behaviors that are unacceptable. When's the last time you looked at your school handbook? What handbook? Do we have a handbook? Oh, who'd have thought?
Just revised it.
Just revised it. All right. And so, revising that, how we roll it out, then it becomes how, so everybody's on the same page. Tight, loose, tight. when I look at a handbook, these actually, I looked at a handbook, pulled up some handbooks online, and this was a list of 8 or 9, 10 things. It wasn't called one thing. It was just like, you can't do this if you're doing this. That's right. You can't do this. You can't do this. You can't do this. And when you looked at them, they all came down to, okay, they're resisting authority. They're refusing to do what they're reasonably able to do. Now, Dennis back there is sitting at his desk, and you've just finished direct instruction, and he's like this now. Is he refusing? That goes back to relationships. Remember that young man on the third slide, sitting and staring? I know Dennis's, his father's out of the picture, his mom just lost her job. What does Dennis need? So all of these expectations, the expectations and these behaviors that we have to be framed within that culture that we want to develop, so that the student does extend his hand to shake rather than to shoot. So you'll notice that these are just ideas, just not suggestions, just ideas. They're pretty well encompassing. The key is, whatever you develop for these behaviors, they have to be consistent, classroom to classroom. We're going to talk about where you store that data. What's that data look like a little bit in a few minutes. So we have to be very specific about what our expectations are, what these behaviors are, because what's going to happen is, here's that makes sense again. Here's the makes sense. Remember, we said fighting, any physical altercation. Altercation means a conflict. Any physical altercation between students involving, but not, limited to, pushing, pulling, kicking, slapping, striking with any object. Whatever you come up with. Because then we look at our expectations and how we're going to tie it together so it makes sense. Fighting is not respectful because it does not show regard for someone. That's how we defined respect. Were you showing regard for someone when you did that? No. But okay, we can get to the buts and how we're going to work through this. Was it respectful? No. We want them to develop that self-discipline, that self-regulation with their behavior, and we do that in a system that is designed and structured with expectations and procedures. By the way, young man, it's not safe either. Why? Because it doesn't keep you or someone else from being hurt. So when we define these, however you're going to define these in your handbook, and teach what these mean to students, we want to make sure that we then relate those to specific behaviors. Because then they understand, oh, this is not, you're right. I'm going against what we expect of ourselves and expect of others. We're on that foundational, that what must all students know and be able to do, and we're there, we spent the time there, invested the time, not spent it, invested the time there because that is that bedrock foundation. Everything comes back to what must they know and be able to do, establishes how do we teach it, how do we structure the environment, how do we know they've learned, and so forth and so on. The other 4 questions. Here is a way to assess where you are as a building or as a district. When it comes to, remember somebody who highlighted shared? Shared. Beliefs and expectations regarding behavior in this case. Is that consistent? Because we get into trouble if something happens here and there's a disconnect between us. There's a problem if something happens here and I get called in. Those beliefs and expectations have to be shared, as the terminology must be shared, that understanding. What is this behavior? What's our expectation? How do we define that expectation? Whether it's responsible, respectful, safe. We're all on the same page. Again, tight, loose, tight. This is the tight on this end. We have to have that shared expectation. We can talk about how we get there, some wiggle room there, but we're going to get to that safe learning environment. Shared understanding of practices. So we have a shared understanding, we have shared beliefs, expectations, terminology, and practices. Then we go into commitment. Commitment to practices and accepting that accountability and respectability, our accountability and responsibility ourselves. Because the buses parking in that lot, they're assuming a responsibility at that point, especially if I've already had that conversation with them. So as administrators, we're going to have some tough conversations when a person is not being responsible and they have to be held accountable. You have to call them on it. All right. If you're administrators, if you're not administrators, you can share this with them. Share the slide deck, say, hey, read it and weep. No. Just a summary of what we've talked about when it comes to that foundational piece. Expectation, definitions, examples, non-examples, and providing that clear. We talked about, during the break, we talked about sixth graders coming in and how do we get those sixth graders from, coming from the elementary and doing this? That leads us into our second question: how do we design the environment and the instruction so that they do behave as expected, conduct themselves as expected? By the way, what do we mean by as expected? Revert to question 1. You'll hear that several times today. Go back to question 1. And when you think of that, designing the environment, remember what I talked about culture. The least desired behavior, if tolerated over time, can become the norm. So it's imperative that we design the instruction, the environment, and the instruction. Instruction, by the way, is going to be somewhat irrelevant if the environment's not set up for success. Remember that student at the top of the hill going one way or another? The environment has to be there. We're going to talk about environment first. That first question was preventative in nature. We want to, our real responsibility is to prevent any issues by being on the same page and then setting the environment and teaching students what's expected. This teaching what students are expected, excuse me, is, I'm probably coughing right into that mic, is a preventative action. It will, like I said, determine that culture and climate over time, that culture over time. They'll talk today about explicit instruction. I won't go into a lot of that. We talked about the sixth graders. Okay, now we're going to explain what our expectations are. We're going to teach that explicitly. We're going to go over it regularly, not go over it, we're going to review it regularly. In elementary, you see that all the time. Let's walk in there, let's walk down, let's walk. How do we stand in line? How do we, it's ideally, it's going to be regularly and then, I hate to say enforced, reinforced consistently. And it's proactive. This does, at all levels, but tier 1, globally. Remember I talked about, I think I called him Dennis, sitting there with his head down. We talked about, is he being insubordinate? Having that relationship. So there is going to be differentiation there. Knowing that, third slide, knowing that student and understanding, having that culture where I understand what's going on and I'm going to support him. Those 3 domains, that mental wellness interacting with discipline. What we know from research is someday when you're not here, I'm not going to know. I'll know what to do, but you explain it in such a concise way, I don't waste time going 3 minutes in the discussion of Hattie. I need to borrow your slide, but I'm not going to put that slide in there.
Okay, hold on, stop right there. Coming from my car.
Okay.
Gonna talk. We might get this recorded.
You're on Candid Camera. You probably don't remember that show, but that was always a good show.
Maybe just make sure.
Now you're always on Candid Camera with cell phones. Ugh. Do you need to come up here? You can be seen. Okay.
All right. So John Hattie, anyone familiar? Have you? All right. So John Hattie does what's called meta-analyses. And what that means is that he looks at studies from all over the world and he combines them in. And what this does for teachers is it gives us the opportunity to take away some of the excuses. It means that we don't say, well, gosh, that might work for those kids in Australia, but not my kids, not here at Griffith, at Lake Central. So it puts all of these from all over the world. It's high poverty, it's low poverty. So it combines all of these studies from all over the world so that we can get a good picture of what instructional strategies work for kids. And so when you look at the chart that John has here, the first column is what's called the effect size. And in its typical year with a typical teacher, kids get between a 0.15 and a 0.4 effect size. So what John Hattie calls the zone of desired effects is anything above 0.4. So that's where you're going to get more bang for your buck. So for example, on here he has 0.82, decreasing disruptive behavior. You'll notice that's 0.8, which is double the typical school year. And you see that in classrooms. You know when behavior is well managed and there's fewer disruptions, kids are learning more during that school year. And so it puts some teeth behind, it puts some research behind what you're already seeing in the classrooms. It's important to note that these are all qualitative studies, all quantitative studies, meaning it's not teacher perception. These are the researchers following their rubrics and things like that. So it only includes those. What you look at on the right two columns are the number of studies. So in 140 studies that John Hattie looked at, he studied 5,940 students. And so he saw that effect size in there. So it changes depending on how many analysis he uses or how many studies he uses in those meta-analyses. We're going to talk more about this in the afternoon, so if you're furiously taking notes, I have a slide that kind of introduces all of this, but something on here to note is that these are students from all over the world, all different kinds of kids, and it's combined together by John Hattie for this effect size. So for the purpose of what John's going to talk about today, consider 0.4 being your average school year. So anything over 0.4, really, really good, okay?
Thanks, Nikki. On to the left. Look at those 6 real quick. Thinking about what Nikki said. To the left of that table in your packet, I'd like you to use these numbers to assess what it looks like in your school or your district. For each of those, rate it with one of those numbers. Find someone out of your district and discuss where your schools are or your districts are with these and share ideas. Take about 2 minutes to do that. Pretty simple. We'll go to this district.
Hey, I'm welcome.
Again, you're going to share your district's observations, your successes and struggles.
Here's so much about the middle, we can't do that in middle school.
Yeah.
The middle school schedule won't allow us to do that.
Yeah.
So now, based on these questions, and again, that question, and based on these factors, another thing that Rick DeFore says in PLC at Work is that those professionals who know better have the obligation to do better.
Yikes.
So now that we know this is what works, where are we on what works? what are we going to do about it? And we talked about a lot of expectations and procedures. They act this way. So going back to that first question now, going back to the districts, and ideally I would love to work with a district administrators and teachers on this just so we can frame these conversations within the district. Because that has to change. If we're finding these issues, we have now the responsibility to act on those findings that we have. So again, take this back, say, hey, we got work to do. Okay, thank you. This slide, an example of classroom procedures. I'm not going to read that. That is for your reference. Here are some examples of that. What does it look like when we have these, when we're greeting students? What's the expectation for being at the door and greeting students? Do I know the names of students? I don't have time today, but I would urge you to engage in this exercise with your colleagues. Think of a student, write the initials of that student on a piece of paper. What would you talk about that would really excite that student? What is that student's passion? Would light him up? Write that down. What does that student fear the most? If you wanted to talk to that student about their future, themselves, how would you frame that conversation with that particular child? And like I said, we would do that if we had more time, because if you're going to teach them, you have to reach them first. I have to know that child. I have to know what's happening with him, with her. It takes time, but we go to ball games. We interact with kids beyond the classroom. We know families, if at all possible. You know, my son was in a large high school. He was in fairly large, Huntington North. He swam and played tennis. Those are, you know, it's not football, it's not basketball, it's swimming and playing tennis. Can't tell you the number of times the principal, I won't say the name, but the principal was at the tennis match. How's he doing? Was he going to play doubles again this year? How do you know that my son played doubles? Hey, how's he doing in the 50 free? Wow. To see a principal in a large high school at tennis matches, at swim meets, knew the kids. You cannot replace that factor, that interrelationship, those relationships. Okay. Think about these factors as you watch this video. So have those factors in front of you as you watch this video and see what you, check off what you see.
And say, in this classroom, I tell my students, you can say what you want to say as long as you say it respectfully. In a classroom, rapport is so important. When I think the students know that I'm not going to attack them, so I respect them, so they respect me, I think it's a dual thing. Jocelyn, you have the floor.
Michaela. I would like to add on to the conversation and say immigrants because during the...
I am big on them saying each other's names.
Rachel, what did you talk about in your groups? In our group, we talked about how...
Students called on each other because I think that's respect. Because that's one of the things I think about Common Core is that you're teaching them to be college, career, and life ready, teaching them how to interact socially. They can't just say you, hey you. They call each other by name.
You see when those factors are in place what it looks like. And this afternoon you're going to talk a lot more about the instructional component of behavior, what that would look like. But the environment has to be there. She had the environment structured so that instruction could take place. Take about 30 seconds to look at those pictures. Think of what environment would promote safety in learning. Think of those two with respect to safety and learning. Okay, what do you think?
I feel like the circle tables like create like your smaller group, so if you were nervous about saying something, you're only saying it to a smaller group, so you're feeling safe about what you're saying instead of sharing it out to your class of 25.
Okay. Others? Certainly you have thoughts. It allows you to split up the students for what?
That aggravate each other.
That aggravate each other. Maybe you want to split them, yeah. You want to split them up.
Well, and the teacher can kind of be in the middle.
Yeah.
And be able to get where she needs to get quickly. If
Yes.
there's a behavior she needs, just to kind of use that proximity control to kind of address things.
Mm-hmm.
I think they both can be, safe environments. I think it's the behavior of the adult in the situation and the expectations. Are the kids taught how to behave in both of those things?
Yes. Exactly. Both of those lend themselves to safety. We're looking at trip hazards. We're looking at stuff all over the place. No, not in these two environments. Those environments can be switched. This can be switched. These can be switched. The point is that that environment is set up at that time with the students in mind and with the expectations that we're going to be safe and learn at high levels. As long as those factors are always in mind, we will set up that environment so it promotes learning. What will promote the highest level of learning? About 30% of your wall space should be clear. Studies 2014, 15, 17, I think 20, looking at studies, high visual stimulation starts to inhibit learning. So when you have a classroom, an elementary classroom, you go in and you're almost overloaded, sensory overload. Think of students who do have issues with that, with color. So if I have an anchor chart, let's say I'm in 4th grade or 5th grade, I'm talking about science, we're talking about ecosystems, biology or whatever. Okay, I have this anchor chart, and as we talk about that, it's important for them to use. But at the end of that unit, that's coming down. I may have another anchor chart for the next unit, I may not. Some things may need to be up there all year. But we have to be very selective of what we put on those walls, what colors they are. Because it is shown that that affects learning.
Can you give us a citation for that?
I'll send you those, because they talked about kindergarten. They talked about kindergarten. I mean, we're not handing out, Adderall at the door just because our room is such a... So, a little bit of... There's a little bit of color here, a little bit of stimulation, but you notice that nothing is just on the bulletin board. They're located, they're not just slapped up anywhere, number one. Also, if you look at this, little things, again, the environment, climate, as soon as you walk in, pretty much equally spaced, about the same height. When you're posting students' work, how are you posting it? Or is it put so that students sense that order? You're having visions now. I can tell some of you are getting nervous about classrooms.
I have to share my favorite story.
Yes.
I started my career as a school psychologist, and I was doing a classroom observation. And the teacher, I think she was 2nd grade, it was elementary. She had started the year, I think, with like 4 or 5 class rules, like what you should do, right? But she had added rules throughout the year. So she had additional pieces of paper, and they were all along the top of her chalkboard at the time. And you could see, like, the handwriting got a little messier as she, it was like, every day she got angry, there was another, and more rules added. And, I mean, there were probably 25 rules. And she just, it was just extra, more and more pieces of paper lined up across the top of the chalkboard.
So, I'd love a picture of that. So when we design that environment and we design our instruction based on our core beliefs and our expectations, we can prevent that with teachers. Hopefully prevent them from having the issues so that students don't have the issues. I love that, the writing getting worse and worse. Again, looking back at Terry Scott's work, it is important to have that proximity. So there's an intentionality in the way the classroom, the environment is set up. In this case, he's talking about having that access for proximity to students pretty readily. And you actually see, you can't really see it from there, but there are X's here. Here are the ones I have to get to quickly. Here are the ones I have to be able to get to in as few steps as possible. I may have to separate them, but I need to be able to get to them right now. So again, intentionality in the way that you set up that classroom. What's on the wall, how that environment's designed. We talked about accountability and responsibility as we're setting up that environment and our expectations. If our expectation is safety, respect, and responsibility, that's our expectation of ourselves. So when you're assigned to supervise, you're assigned to supervise. If I'm on the playground and I'm talking, I would go out to the playground a lot, and you have two adults over here talking. That area is now not being supervised, where they're playing kickball. That's where you're assigned. Now, it's one thing if you come over and you have to share information and go back. You have the little kindergartner that comes up to you, Mr. Purcell, and they want to tell you about, their 4-H project, and that's okay. And I would tell them, okay, I am listening to you, but I have to watch, so I'm gonna listen. So go ahead and tell me about it. And I'm asking questions. Okay, hang on just a minute. Is that our expectation? Okay. So you know what I'm talking about, right? All right, go ahead. That's that supervision. We have, as school personnel, we have a standard of care, a higher standard of care, because we have to provide that safe environment. Safe environment, supervision, qualified staff, those are all things legally that courts look at when there are issues, injury issues, tort liability issues. So you have to be able to defend, as an administrator, this is what I told you, this is what I told you to watch out for, and oh, by the way, you were supervising, but guess what? I'm supervising you. Because we're going to hold each other accountable, mutually accountable. So if we're going to have an environment, we have to monitor that environment. And who's responsible for monitoring that environment? We are, the adults. Safe learning at high levels. Are you going to talk about this afternoon? Do you talk a little bit about examples, non-examples? Okay. I just put this slide in here. I thought you had that. I put this slide in here, though, to show you this fits into that designing environment, designing instruction. They're interrelated. You cannot separate those. You have to teach what you expect. But you can't teach it in a chaotic environment and expect different results than what you've had. So that instruction and the environment go hand in hand. Okay, share these. If you're not a school administrator, if you are a school administrator, take a look. I don't think we have any here. If not, give them the packet and say, here's what you're responsible for. I can just see a teacher coming into my office. Hey, John, that's what you're responsible for. By the way, I gave one to the superintendent too, so he knows. Okay, third question. How do we monitor what we expect? Because we have to measure, we have to monitor and measure what we expect. If we say, these are our expectations, these are the behaviors, how do we know if they are behaving or conducting themselves in the way that they are conducting themselves? Not only how do we know, What are we going to do about it? Which is our questions 4 and 5. So monitoring now comes into, it's almost reaction rather than prevention. It's kind of both. You're going to use it to prevent future issues, but now the data we're looking at is based on something that's happened. The first two, what must they know and be able to do? How do we design the instruction and the environment so they do it, they act that way? Now the third one, how do we know? Are they conducting themselves as expected? That is both prevention and reaction. What you're going to see as we go through these slides, we have to look at data systems. You have to have timely access to those systems, and easily understood. If I pull up your system now, and I ask this teacher and this teacher, first of all, how do you get that information? How do you get that? Well, go ahead and run that report for me, would you? Can they do that in a timely manner? Then can they explain it to me, and can this person say, yes, we're on the same page with that? Remember, we talked about those shared expectations, shared terminology. Now it's putting that to work, that shared expectations and terminology in the real world. We've taught it, we've set the environment for it, now we're measuring it. But to measure, we have to get to the data, and we have to have the right data stored. So we'll look at storing data, that timely access to it, and then how then we will react to that, because it's not about the students first, it's about us. We talked about middle schoolers. If we know better, we have the responsibility to do better. So if you know there's an issue and we don't act on it, it's on us. So for the data that we have, we're now going to have a focused reaction. It's not going to be, well, I think, well, I do appreciate that you think that way and you feel that way. What do the numbers tell us? What does that tell us? We're going to go based on what we have measured. This data is how we maintain that climate and culture. Remember, it's formed over time. By what? Climate. It's formed over, culture formed over time by that climate, which is what? Decisions made every day. Decisions we make here are going to either maintain or disrupt what we want to be our ideal culture, which goes back to the question. Do we want our culture to happen by chance or by design? We use numbers to do that, to get there. We always want to get down to the root cause for students not conducting themselves as expected. Academically, or any comprehensive needs assessment, when you do it for your school improvement plan, it always starts with students. Always starts with students. Students are not reading at grade level in 3rd grade. Performing, 70% of our students are performing below grade level in 3rd grade reading. Why? And you start that root cause analysis. Why? Well, because, why is that? Well, because they don't have comprehension. Why don't they have comprehension? Well, because they're not understanding what they're reading. Why aren't they understanding what they're reading? It always comes down to an adult at the end. It always comes down to us. I guess we haven't developed the capacity, the skills to really teach reading in an explicit and systematic way. It's going to be the same thing, behavior. The students aren't. Okay, let's do a root cause. Why aren't they doing that? Why? Oh, I guess we're not consistent. So it comes back to, we put the mirror up and it comes back to who? Me. You. So, the first, I guess, non-negotiable is collecting the data. The procedures, the processes for collecting data. How do you collect data in your districts or your buildings? How do you collect that data?
We have, what do they call, infraction sheets,
Infraction sheets?
and they get turned in every week, and then, or every day if there's something that needs to be disciplined. And then we get a weekly report. The administrators get a weekly report of what those
Infractions are?
infractions were.
This is something we've looked at this year, so everything is logged in Skyward.
Mhm.
What we found is we have like, do you remember how many categories we looked at? There were like 30 categories for what they could label behavior as, and they all overlap. So when you showed that
Expectations
insubordination
and behaviors.
And then what does it look like? I mean, we started the process of how can we narrow that down, but then the administrators got really like protective of some of the categories. Like, oh, we like that category. Like, we had things like unspecified area. What does that mean?
Wow. Take that to
Right. So
due process.
We are trying, and our motivation in that was we can't collect data on the behavior and even compare between buildings because we have so many different categories.
Shared understanding,
Right,
shared
and
responsibility.
people aren't using them consistently. So we're trying to narrow that down. But it does, when we were looking at that as we were trying to design our MTSS system. Because we can't make good decisions on interventions unless we have good data, and the data is problematic.
Faulty data
Yep.
will result in faulty decisions. That there has to be a system for doing this. And that system goes back, remember what we said, questions 2 through 5 go back to question 1. Core beliefs, shared expectations, shared terminology. When you talk about behavior, for example, with, I didn't call it lying, but providing false information. I mean, it's very simple. Did the student, as a teacher, did the student tell you something that was not true? Yes. Do you know that he did that intentionally? Yeah, he told me he knew it was wrong. Okay, then he provided false information. Done. Did he wrote a note, forged his parent's signature. So he provided false information to you. Do you know that he did that intentionally? Yeah. Okay, we're done. So we try to logically wrap those into as few as possible. Not, I like this one, not so much. Sorry. Not only do we gather that material and then we store it, or gather the material, collect it, now we have to store it, access it, and analyze it. So when I said before, hey, show me the report on such and such. Can I see his behaviors? Okay. Now, I've had, in schools that we've talked to, we've had schools say, well, I'm not allowed to see that, I'm not allowed to see this. This information is not shared. All I can tell you is, you must have access, within the law, you must have access to the information needed to keep that student and all other students safe, period. If you're on the witness stand, you have to explain why you did not have access to that information. FERPA or medical information. When our kids took field trips, you have this, not the parents, but you have this other adult who does not have that student. Yes, he has bee sting allergies, and we do have an EpiPen. Well, he's not. How can you share that medical information? He's on a field trip with this teacher, and he has an allergy. He's allergic to bees. Are we going to let him die? No. You need that information. It's reasonable. And then we have the expectation of those adults. What do you do with confidential information? Nothing. Good. Then we come back to accountability and responsibility. So we have to be able to not only collect it, store it, so we can readily access it when needed by whoever needs it. However you you talk to attorneys, you talk to your superintendent, you decide what that's going to look like. The point is, there's no excuse for not having what you need when you need it when it comes to safety. In a timely manner, and then you have to have a process. How do we analyze that? Consideration for analysis. I talked about students. But when we analyze our data, what we're looking at, Do we think of the environmental factors that were involved in that? Did we set up that environment for student success? There was no teacher there supervising. Really? They were running all over. Really? What was the expectation? Well, we told them they had to just sit. Was that taught at any time? Did we explicitly show them, here's what's expected, now we're going to monitor that? No, I didn't. Relational. Have you ever heard of Missopedia? I always thought it'd be interesting if we had a teacher, her last name was Pedia, and she wasn't married, Missopedia. Because Missopedia means hatred of children. That'd be a great book for little kids, wouldn't it? Missopedia comes to town. That relational factor has to be there. As well as, like I said, the instructional issues. Did we explicitly and systematically teach and then reteach and reinforce what's expected? So when you're looking at that data, it's not, he did this, he did this, he did this. Okay, let's get into some environmental factors. What might that look like? Well, I don't know if you can read this, it's on your slide. But okay, on 323, cafeteria, fourth period, lunch number 2, here are our concerns. What do we have here? We have the expectation noted first. What are the concerns? Well, the concern is you have to keep yourself and others from being harmed. What are those behaviors that we talked about that are prohibited? Fighting, punching, kicking, slapping to cause harm. Here's another expectation, responsibility. What's the procedure on our matrix when it comes to responsibility? Well, in the cafeteria, they're to sit down, talk, eat at an appropriate level. Okay. Based on the relevant data, we look at that and we say, okay, this is what we've seen, this is what we expect. So what did we see? Well, the number of fights increased from 1 to first semester to 5 in the second semester, each resulting from social media posts. All 8th graders during lunch, period 2, were involved. And students report that they cannot hear other people's conversations. Okay, so that's the data some of the data we've collected. That's a synopsis of the data. So we go back and say, okay, yep, those relate to that which was taught. Those are the concerns that the safety and responsibility are not being upheld. Those expectations we've taught. Specifically, we're looking at behavior of fighting. Specifically, we're looking at a procedure that we've established in the cafeteria. They're not sitting down, eating, talking at an appropriate level. So we have a couple issues here. What's the root cause? Let's why it out. Here we come to an adult situation. Well, we had to cut the number of supervisors because we didn't have staff, okay? And this is what you finally come up with. You root cause, you drill down. In this case, we had to cut the number of supervisors. Some students are threatening others, demeaning others in posts, in their social media posts. And the staff, overall, as we've looked at it, staff are not reviewing expectations consistently. So we've come down to those 3 biggies: supervision, those posts that are occurring, those are students, and then it comes down to our teaching or reviewing those expectations. So what's expected again? Let's go back to these 2, safety and responsibility in the cafeteria based on those behaviors we're seeing. So what are we going to do? We're going to add staff, we're going to add supervision. We're going to reteach conduct expectations in the cafeteria, stressing noise level. We're going to provide specific interventions to students who are fighting on social media, what's allowed, what's not allowed within this school, and then maybe individually working with them, the counselor, somebody working with them on some conflicts that they're having to prevent that from getting worse in other places. And we're going to review those 3 biggies that we have, those 3 global expectations: safety, responsibility, and respect, with all students. And we're going to commit ourselves now. We've been slacking on that to do it more consistently. This just gives you, this is just an example of something. It gives you, you have to take that information After you collect it, you stored it, but now you have to do something with it. So when issues arrive, how can you systematically respond to that in a way that is logic, that allows you to drill down to root causes and then act on those? In your packet, there's a website, just another one, another example. If you do not have a process for analyzing, I would urge you to do that. In this case, it's not the process, but the tool that leads to the process. We'll talk about how you respond in a minute. Questions on that? Thoughts? Do you have something like that in place? Where you analyze? Do you? Good. Is it a document?
Yes.
Is it really? Is it similar to that? Does it location and?
Yes, it's similar.
Good.
Not exactly the same, but it's similar, yeah.
Something that, you know, that's the wonder of having different districts here. Hey, can you shoot me a copy of that just so we can get a look? Good. Okay, Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, Miss So-and-so, got your work cut out for you. Put it on their desk. Intervention. How do we respond when students do not conduct themselves? On the original slide, I had conduct themselves first and then not conducting themselves. And I put not conduct themselves in the red because that's generally where we go with misbehavior. For some reason, we end up there. We're not in the red for students conducting themselves. How do we respond? This is going to be a focused reaction. And it's going to be based on the root cause with the expectation that if we do after we analyze the data, if we do this, then that root cause, that behavior, will change. Very systematically, what could we have done to prevent this? We're looking at environmental, we're looking at the relational. If we then will no longer occur, will diminish, will not exist, disappear. When we're responding, we want to talk specifically about, go back to those procedures and expectations. Everything's anchored in that first question. What do we expect? What behaviors go under that? Well, this. Did you show responsibility when you? Are you teaching that we show responsibility by not? Goes back to that instruction. Again, this is a focused reaction. It's not, okay, all students, we're not going to allow you to. No. This is a focused reaction based on our data. And it requires monitoring of implementation. So we have the data. We focused on that. We've developed this. If we do this, then this will this. Now we have to monitor it. If you don't monitor it, it's not measured, and if it's not measured, it's not going to change. So, again, globally, because we're going to get into instruction today, and you'll talk about some tiers. But in Tier 1, we're looking at MTSS, we're looking at global instruction. We're looking at all students, providing that foundation. So, if we know in our action plan that we're not meeting the needs of all students, we have to know why. We have to consider, for example, let's say a student has been doing something consistently. We've talked with them. Okay, first of all, does the student have the skills? What's the context of where that's happening, how that's happening? Can we find any challenges, routines, activities that are aggravating that? We are then going to, as we collect this data, use that data to develop a plan. And I'm not talking about FBA, behavior intervention plan. I'm talking about little Alicia or little Johnny. I'm talking about the little student in second grade who just loved to pummel kids on the playground back when we had those. Remember the plastic things you put on that for a cause, like, you know, heart disease and all that. Yeah, I had a bunch of them in my desk. Kale, come here. Put them on. I said, next time you want to punch somebody, what did we talk about? It's not safe to do that. These are going to remind you of that. So I remember the first day he came in. He goes, hey, they worked. You want them back? I said, I'll take them back, but you're going to come and see me every day. We're going to put them back on. Long story short, just something simple like that worked. And then it didn't work by itself because I'm saying, okay, Kale, tell me about it. So what happened today? So what made you not hit him? Well, I stopped and I thought about, okay, good. So you're thinking, you're stopping, you're pausing. Good. Because I didn't want to hurt him. So you have regard for other people. You want them to be safe. Good job, Kale. Tell me more. So it's not just putting those on, it's that relational piece. Also talking to the supervisor in the playground saying, kind of keep, and they were always keeping an eye on, but again, unfortunately, it was, oh, he's doing, whoa, what do you mean? Oh, he's doing. What are you doing to prevent that? We've talked about that. Where should he be? How are you going to guide him to do that? You're not going to yell at him across the playground to do that. Relational pieces. Supervision to make sure that happens based on our beliefs. Possible actions, visual supports, reteaching the skills, in this case, visual support around his wrists. You notice that these, who do these pertain to? To whom do these pertain if you're an English teacher? Adults. Remember, it starts with us. And then specific things that we can do as adults. There's fluidity between those tiers. We've talked about that. There's that fluidity between those levels. Remember, the kids are going to go up and down. That behavior is related to the academic and the mental wellness. We always have to be mindful of that this is not happening in a vacuum. We want to be mindful that this behavior, again, is not happening in a vacuum. Remember that little kid, that little child there that had his head down and he was doing his homework or working in class? We want to get to the root cause. So if that child over time has been experiencing this, we have to look ourselves in the mirror and saying, who had number 2? Didn't you all have number 2? So what are we doing about number 2? Professionals who know better have the obligation to do better. So it goes back to us. So having that relationship with that child, but focusing on when that student's acting out, we see him every day with his head like this, you know, and he's writing because he's mad, and well, yeah, talking academic supports. Because when he looks himself in the mirror, what he says at home, I'm stupid. No. Tier 3, then you're going to get into those intense, more intense components of support, actually intense interventions. You're going to be talking about working with, doing your FBAs, your functional behavior assessments, your behavior intervention plans, possibly outside agencies. School psychologists may be doing some assessments. But again, regardless of the tier, what must they know and be able to do? How do we set that environment, that culture, so students do behave as they are expected to, and then self-regulate, monitor themselves to conduct themselves? How do we teach it? How do we set the environment so it happens? The classroom environment, the school environment. And then how do we monitor that data to make sure it's happening? And we can prevent with that data, something's been happening, but we're going to prevent it from happening again by what? We're going to do this, so this changes. It's very systematic. Our task, remember, Our task at the beginning is to be intentional and systematic in the way that we structure our system and our environment. Intentional and systematic. Okay, put this on your administrator's desk. Again, if we were working as teams, I would go over this with the administrators and we would talk about what this looks like specifically to them with respect to the slides. And then when students are conducting themselves, it's important. Classroom management, specific instruction for conduct, those relationships, those are all important, as is that recognition of success, individually and collectively. So we know that we're doing well. Hey, great job. Now it's going to be within reason. We're going to give you this if you do this. Now we're not going to hand out lollipops and that kind of thing. Well, you can, but we're going to set up reasonable ways to celebrate as a school. We want to set goals for students with that Tier 1 into Tier 2. You need to be monitoring what you, because with this little guy, I'm just making up a name, little, who do I call him, Kale? Little Kale, he hasn't been in this week. He's just popped in to see me and explained what was going on and how he did it. Okay. So I'm constant conversation with the teachers. She's reinforcing, I am so proud of you. You're doing it. You're amazing. You are amazing. So we're celebrating in small ways, individually as well as collectively. We want to do it in prudent ways, but we really want to anticipate changes. Sears, as an example, started as the first catalog store. Catalog. Why weren't they the first Amazon? Why weren't they the first to? Because when you're on your way to success, success breeds failure unless you recognize what's happening in the future, unless you have some anticipation of changes. For example, if you have an increase in your a different culture in your school, they're building this new subdivision out here. They're building this housing over here because they're bringing this business. How's that going to affect our culture? What will we do proactively? Because we've celebrated. We're doing so well. It's great here. Fantastic. Now, you have your eyes set on what is expected. You have your eyes set on success. Are you anticipating changes that will affect that? Again, positively or negatively. So we always have to be looking at the future. On those Tier 1, 2, and 3, PBIS, these are pretty general. But PBIS, I just found these, so I put them up here. PBIS has interventions, lists of interventions that you can take a snapshot of, and they're divided by tiers, which is kind of interesting. Just some ideas of what you might do within those 3 tiers, because I didn't go into a lot of detail there. Okay, so our objectives. Our objectives. Do you understand what a systematic approach is now? Check. School culture. Which one of those stands out to you right now as this will be our challenge? If any of them do. Which one stands out to you?
All staff.
All staff. Good. Circle, highlight, cut out, put on a wall. It's good that you recognize that. What do you mean by all staff? For what?
All of that, shared, yeah, all those shared beliefs.
Shared beliefs.
And like working together to have a common like metric that we're all using.
Which goes back to what you said. We have 75 things for insubordination or whatever. Yeah. He's picking at his ear. That's insubordination. Telling him to stop it. What? Others that stood out. That, hey, we need to attend to this.
I think even like going back to that number 1, like now that I get that, like that's super important.
Yeah.
What, every time you're doing something or teaching some kind of behavior, it's really, you gotta go back to that first step and then make your way up.
Yes. All those questions come back to number one when we talk about those 5 steps. And that first question is rooted in that first objective.
Because I feel like a lot of times we just want number 5 to happen, like we want the behavior to stop.
Yeah.
But we're not going all the way back and like making that happen.
Because whose responsibility is it to change that behavior? Set the environment. Student may still do it, but hey, the table is set, the food is there, you're expected to eat, you're choosing not to eat, now it's on you. I've shown you how to eat, it's all there. We've taught, we've expected, we've set the environment. Now we can work on those, what do we do when they're not behaving as expected? Gail, you have books.
I do.
And by the way, I'm going to do, I'll show, it's here, to do those are resources to check out. That is a QR code for these slides online. For that Padlet, those are the references. And if you would, when you're done here, after we bribe you, if you would, I need to know, again, I need to, just like kids need to know, just like you need to know, I need to know what's working, what's not working, because I want to help a lot of people work through this. So, okay.